in an apocalyptic world of monsters, where people can turn into monsters under the influence of an infection. A teenage loser became infected and could turn into a horrible monster. The infected superhumans have created an organization to protect their species by exterminating uncontrolled transformers. The events took place in the schoolyard, where children's screams were heard. 2 teenagers were playing soccer in the schoolyard. The boy with the number 10 on his t-shirt was kicking the ball. He had brown, long hair and a beautiful smile named Jinwoo. After making a maneuver, the teenager scored a goal, knocking the goalkeeper down. His teammates ran up to him. They praised the teenager for scoring 2 out of 3 goals. Jinwoo was happy at that moment. He had everything a teenage boy could dream of. Girls shouted from the stands, openly expressing their affection for the football player. But there was one special girl in the crowd. Her name was Seo-hee. She had long blonde hair and extraordinary beauty. One of the players with the number 7 on his shirt, Hak Seok-gyo, seemed to be head over heels in love with her. He immediately noticed that Seo-hee had let her hair down. Jinwoo told his team to get ready. The next half began. The teams were tense, and the battle was getting fiercer. Suddenly, one of the players made a maneuver, and the ball went to player number 7. Hak Seok-gyo felt that this was his moment of glory. The football player ran closer to the goal and intended to kick the ball. He thought that if he scored a goal, Seo-hee would notice him immediately. Suddenly, his team yelled for him to pass the ball to Jinwoo, but Seok-gyo said that he could do it too, and he hit the ball with all his might so that it flew into the sky. Other players saw this and simply did not understand what had happened. Unfortunately, Seo-hee was also shocked by this act. Then a player number 8 ran up to Hak Seok-gyo and hit him on the back of the head, shouting curse words. The teenager just scratched the back of his head and smiled guiltily, saying that he had overdone it a bit. Hak Seok-gyo immediately ran to find the ball but tripped on the way. The team was indignant about who had put him in the game in the first place. Meanwhile, the boy had already reached the end of the field and the ball flew far away. He blamed himself for the fact that he would have been better off doing manhwa, or modeling. There, he would have been a success. Suddenly, Seok-gyo saw a dog growling in front of him, looking for something in the trash. He thought that food waste only harmed stray dogs. Suddenly, the dog returned to Seok-gyo. In its mouth, it held a human leg, which was covered in blood, just like the animal's face. The teenager could not believe his eyes that he really saw it. The dog did not look like a dog at all. It had bright yellow eyes and a rather human face. Suddenly, someone put his hand on Hak Seok's shoulder from behind. The guy was scared and screamed. He fell to the floor. One of the team members was standing in front of him, not understanding why Seok-gyo was screaming so much. The guy started muttering something incomprehensible under his breath, and eventually said that there was a strange dog in the dumpster. The football player looked at the trash, but there was nothing there, just a pool of blood. Hak Seok argued that the dog man had just been here, but his friend didn't believe him. He just said that the guy should stop fantasizing and get back on the field as soon as possible. Hak Seok-gyo did not know that the very next day he would cease to be human. The events moved to a bustling city, namely to a pizzeria. A breathless Hak Seok-gyo came running into the restaurant, saying that he had been choosing a gift for a long time and hoped he was not too late. An hour earlier, a boy came into the classroom and said that Jinwoo had invited everyone to Seo-hit's birthday party and ordered everyone to be at the pizzeria in the evening. Hak Seok-gyo was holding a watch with a cute cat on it. He smiled as he looked at his gift and hoped his friend would like it. Meanwhile, the birthday girl was already opening her gifts and holding an incredibly beautiful pendant. But it seems that Seo-hee was not very happy with such an expensive gift from Jinwoo. Her face looked very upset. Suddenly, the girl put the gift back and gave it to the boy, saying that she could not accept his gift. Meanwhile, everyone sat down at the table and ate pizza. Seo-hee said that she should have paid for the food herself. But Jinwoo said it was nothing and asked if he had upset the girl. She replied in the negative. Meanwhile, Hak Seok-gyo was hiding behind a tall flower pot and listening in on the conversation. He was very nervous and thought that everyone would make fun of him for the gift. Suddenly, Seo-hee spotted her friend hiding. Seok-gyo screamed in fright. The guy came out of his hiding place and greeted the girl, saying that he was passing by. But he didn't have time to speak. A tall guy who came up behind Hak Seok-gyo snatched the gift and started laughing at him. Hak Seok became nervous and tried to snatch the gift from the ignorant man's hands, saying that it wasn't a gift, which he immediately regretted. Meanwhile, The girls sitting at the table were watching. The girl with the black hair laughed at Seok-gyo's gift and said it was terrible. Meanwhile, Seo-hee was nice and told the boys to give her a gift. The tall guy didn't understand why she was behaving like that, and the girl said it was her gift. The teenager eventually gave the watch to the birthday girl. So he opened the gift and a sincere smile appeared on her face. The girl immediately put on her gift and said that she also liked Doraemon. She thanked me for the watch and said she would always wear it. Seok-gyo's heart beat frantically and his face broke into a smile. Meanwhile, it was already dark and the events moved to residential buildings. His mother scolded Hak Seok-gyo for watching TV for too long because he was going on a trip with his class and had to pack. But his mother's words were the law. So the teenager went to his room to pack for the excursion and simultaneously resented his life. Seok-gyo opened the cabinet in his desk where the knife was lying. He picked it up and thought to himself that he was a real man with this folding knife. Seok-gyo began to dream about how he rescued So-hee, who was tangled in a rope. He looked very brave and pumped up. The girl said that Jinwoo was giving her no peace of mind, and because of that, Seo-hee couldn't propose to Seok-gyo. Suddenly, the guy came back to reality and flopped down on the bed. He smiled like a fool and thought that Seo-hee would definitely appreciate his sincerity. Seok-gyo decides that he will definitely propose to the girl when he shows her his coolness. The boy began to fall asleep, slowly, to his dreams. He thought that after that he would take Seo-hee to look at the stars. In the end, Seok-gyo fell asleep and his last thought was that he wanted to protect her forever. Meanwhile, a gang of hooligans stood over the guy lying on the ground. The ears of the boy with black hair were covered in blood. The gang was fighting with each other. A guy with blonde hair was lying on the floor, and he seemed to be the target of the hooligans. Suddenly, one of the bandits hit him on the chin, and a whole bunch of blood poured out of the poor man's mouth. The blonde fell to the ground and shivered. The guy with the chewed-off ear, who most likely hit the blonde, whimpered and said that his ear hurt a lot. His other friend laughed and told him not to whine because he had climbed up to the poor man himself. The leader said that it was his punching bag. Meanwhile, the victim was lying on the floor and saying quietly that he was hungry. Then, the bully took a stick from his friend and said he wanted to smash the blonde boy's skull. He took a sharp swing, and it looked like the gang leader intended to kill the boy. And then, there was a loud sound of a skull breaking. Someone from the gang asked if the boy was dead, and the leader replied that he was supposed to live. There was a large pool of blood on the floor. The leader fell down to the victim and started going through his pockets, commenting that he could have just given him money, and then this would not have happened. Suddenly, the guy with the cigarette in his hand changed his face. He saw a barely alive blonde man turn into a monster with a long neck, sharp teeth, and 4 pairs of arms. The boy told his leader to look back. His voice was trembling. The bully looked up and was very angry that he was being distracted. Suddenly, his head went through. The guy started screaming and asking what had just happened to him. He said that he did not see anything, and at the same moment his eye fell on his hand. The leader noticed this and shouted. The sight was not for the faint of heart. Suddenly, someone screamed loudly. It was Hak Seok-gyo. He woke up in a cold sweat and gasped loudly. The guy said it was just a nightmare, but he was very scared. Suddenly, his face changed and expressed surprise. Seok-gyo realized that he had forgotten what he had dreamed and why he was so scared. The teenager got out of bed and began to dress, thinking about what he had dreamed. Seok-gyo was thinking that this nightmare was ill-timed before he left. Suddenly, his eyes looked at the alarm clock. They narrowed sharply and my heart beat faster. Seok-gyo realized that he was late for the field trip. He ran to his parents and shouted to his mom that he was late. The parents were in the kitchen and did not understand what was happening. The son was shouting that he was late and should have been at school long ago. But his mother asked what Seok-gyo meant and said that he might be late for school, so he had to eat faster. To which the son said that he was already late and the bus left without him. His mother was surprised and asked if Seok-gyo had forgotten to wake up because he had already gone on a field trip. The boy's face changed dramatically. He was in shock. His mother said it had been a month since he left. Meanwhile, the school bell rang in the schoolyard. 3 classmates were sitting at their desks discussing a 3rd grader named Kyung-jun who had run away from home. He was already in his 30s. The girls at the next desk were gossiping about Ga-young, who had also run away from home with some guy. Meanwhile, Seok-gyo sat alone at the first desk, smiling at his phone. The guy was looking at the photos on his smartphone and couldn't believe that he was really on the tour. He realized that a lot had changed in the past month. which he had forgotten. First, Seok-gyo didn't remember what happened during and after the trip. He thought it was an accident, but there were no marks on his body. He was also unable to talk to his parents because they thought that Seok-gyo was playing a trick on them. Secondly, the number of students who ran away from home increased dramatically. And after the first escape, no one was even alerted. After that, several more students disappeared. After that, everyone began to attribute it to problems in the family and the children's unhealthy psyche. But within a month, 29 students had already left. Some man was on the phone. It was an office where everyone was in a tizzy. People were scared and trying to prevent the publication of articles in the media. Suddenly, a man shouted Han Seok-gyo's name. The guy was scared and got up from his seat. It turned out that it was his teacher, who told him with a smile that the boy had done better than anyone else in the test and had risen to 4th place in the ranking. Everyone applauded him, which embarrassed the teenager. He didn't even remember writing anything. Suddenly, the teacher slammed the ruler sharply on the blackboard. He added that on average, the class's results dropped by 30 points. The teacher became very angry. The man shouted that they shouldn't run away from home, but start studying. He added that with such knowledge, they would be eaten by a large company. In the end, the teacher said that they should not blame their classmates who ran away, but rather stick to their personal goals like Seok-gyo. The man sharply called out to the starosta. Everyone in the class shivered and put their heads down in fear. My classmates started looking at each other. And thirdly, Hwang Jin-woo committed suicide. There were flowers and a photograph on his desk. The teenager, who was in no need of anything, committed suicide a few days after the trip. Suddenly, someone said that the boy was supposedly from an orphanage. Seok-gyo overheard this conversation in the cafeteria. His classmates were discussing the gossip, and their opinions were divided. After losing his memory, this was the most surprising news for Seok-gyo. Meanwhile, the teacher realized that the starosta was dead. He began to call out to the deputy starosta in a trembling voice. She was a girl with short hair. The teacher told her to lead the class in a bow instead of Jin-woo. The girl followed the teacher's command and everyone stood up. Seok-gyo thought about the fact that the death of the headman, the students running away from home, and his memory loss all happened in 1 month. He suddenly wondered if there was any connection between what had happened. Meanwhile, the events moved to the gym. The ball was flying up. Teenagers were playing basketball. Hak Seong-gyo made a maneuver and snatched the ball from the opponent. Others noticed this and told him to block it. Seok-gyo heard this and realized that he had to act immediately. He ran to the end of the field and stopped, and he threw the ball into the opponent's basket. Suddenly, he hit the target. He seemed to be better at basketball than football. The stands screamed. The girls were crazy that Seok-gyo had hit again. His classmates ran up to him and began to congratulate him. The guy felt like Jin-woo at a soccer game. The girls were gossiping about Seok-gyo, saying that he was not tall, but he was skilled. Another girl added that he had gotten prettier lately. Suddenly, someone called out to Seok-gyo. It turned out to be girls who brought him a few drinks. They gave him everything and ran away, ashamed and happy that Seok-gyo had taken their drinks. He felt like a real star at the time, although he realized that he could not drink that much. Suddenly, a tall classmate, Kyung-ho, came up to him and grabbed the boy's neck in a friendly manner. He said that Seok-gyo had become the new star of the school. He added that his classmate had to share his secret because he had brought the team 40 points. The guy said it was a secret. But I wondered in my mind since when he was making friends. Suddenly, Kyung-ho grabbed Seok-gyo harder and invited him to join the soccer team, adding that his friend would coach him. Then a whistle blew in the gym. The coach told the class to sit in a line. A classmate suggested that Seok-gyo study for the test together. Everyone sat down with him. Suddenly, the guy noticed something. Some girl was shouting incomprehensible words under her breath that she was hungry, and sweat was running down her face. She stood up and breathed loudly. Everyone was looking at the girl. Suddenly, she left the room. The coach yelled at her to come back to her seat. The girl was feeling sick, behaving strangely and foaming at the mouth. Suddenly, she hit her head on the pole she was holding onto. Her eyes turned yellow. The girl was just hitting her head, breaking it. Suddenly, there was a loud crunch, and her neck broke. A coach quickly ran up to the girl and grabbed her. Then, other boys came running up and held their classmate to stop mutilating herself. They laid her on the ground. The girl's face was covered in blood, as was her head. No one knew what to do next. The coach commanded everyone to leave the gym and stop staring at their classmate. The man took off his jacket and covered the girl's body with it like a corpse. He shouted for the duty officer to call 119. One of his classmates turned his head to Seok-gyo and said that he was on duty. Meanwhile, the guy was sitting on the floor holding his hand. It was throbbing. Seok-gyo felt a strong and sharp pain in his arm, as if it was about to burst. Suddenly, a classmate screamed loudly. Her friend asked what happened to her, and she was shaking. It turned out that the classmate who had been banging her head against the pillar had gotten up and was bleeding. Everyone else looked at the girl and was shocked. Seok-gyo even took his eyes off his arm and forgot about the pain for a while. We could hear terrible sounds coming from under the girl's sweater. Suddenly, my classmate started laughing like crazy and running away. She bent down on one of her classmates. The sound of tearing skin came from her broken neck. Suddenly, a mouth appeared, and a huge, disgusting tongue came out. He attacked a classmate and bit off his arm. Other teenagers just stood in silence in a stupor and watched their classmate being eaten. Blood was splattered all over the gym. None of the children or teachers even moved because everything looked so unreal. One of his classmates asked his friend if it was a prank and where the hidden camera was. The friend next to him believed his words. Suddenly, a monster's tongue entered the head of the same classmate, cutting through his head. Then the teenagers started running away because they realized that they would all be killed. Panic broke out and everyone ran to the emergency exit. A traffic jam formed near the door. Everyone was pushing and shouting because the door was closed. The lesson turned into a battle. The door lock was indeed chained, as if someone had done it on purpose. The teenagers begged for rescue. The teacher was hearing screams from upstairs because the window to the classroom was open. He asked the students which class had a lesson in the gym. They said they were in the first grade and asked him to close the window because of the noise. Meanwhile, there was a pile of blood and corpses of children in the gym. Most of my classmates were lying dead, with their body parts eaten. But one girl was still alive and laughing nervously in fear. Seok-gyo watched and held his hand. He couldn't believe he was awake. Suddenly, a surviving classmate approached him and begged for help. In response, Seok-gyo yelled at Si-young to come back. The girl trembled and asked again, even though she realized what was about to happen. Tears were streaming from her eyes. Suddenly, she was cut in half by the tongue of a classmate's monster. Si-young didn't even have time to react in time, and half of her body just started falling to the floor. She was cut like a fruit with a katana. Seok-gyo was watching. Suddenly, the monster pointed its tongue sword at him. The guy realized what was about to happen. His eyes widened sharply, but he managed to dodge it. The monster's tongue almost touched his neck. Fortunately, the tongue got stuck in the floor, breaking it. Seok-gyo realized that he had to run away quickly. He had never felt so much danger before. The guy was about to reach the door. It was open. Seok-gyo was halfway to his goal. He kicked in the door and flew out of the gym. Suddenly, the guy abruptly crashed into a closet that was near the wall. Seok-gyo started to get up, holding his head, which he had hit hard. Suddenly, he saw the monster approaching him. The boy mentally calmed himself down and ran around the room, looking for something to defend himself against the monster. Meanwhile, he was getting closer and closer. A sword-like tongue was already coming out of his mouth, about to attack Seok-gyo. Suddenly, the door of the room closed and the handles were propped up with a bat. Unfortunately, this did not help the young man much, and a monster began to crawl out through the door. Seok-gyo had to think of something quickly because the monster was about to get him. Suddenly, the teenager saw a window. Unfortunately, it was closed, so he had nowhere else to go. Seok-gyo slammed himself against the wall and thought that things just couldn't get any worse. The young man sank to the floor and hit his head, wondering if he would make it out alive. Suddenly, Seok-gyo noticed something in front of him. Meanwhile, the monster managed to break through the door and flew into the room. Its head popped out and looked around the room for a victim. Suddenly, the monster's hand stepped on something wet. The entire floor was covered in some kind of liquid, and the monster was in a stupor. Meanwhile, the characteristic sound of a match being lit was heard. After that, there was a sound of falling, and Seok-gyo threw the match into the liquid. Suddenly, the monster caught fire and screamed. Meanwhile, Seok-gyo hid between the shelves and watched his plan work. Suddenly, the monster's eyes widened sharply, as if it had noticed something. His tongue lashed out at Seok-gyo, even though the monster was on fire. There was a stick on the floor, which the beast tripped over. The monster began to fall to the ground, burning in parallel. His body fell on a basket and was pierced with sticks. The monster still screamed and tried to eat Seok-gyo with its tongue. His organ was flying very fast, and it seems that this monster was not easy to defeat. He was about to reach Seok-gyo. Suddenly, the monster's tongue fell to the floor along with its body. The guy was shivering and dripping with cold sweat. It looked like the monster was dead. His trap had worked well. Meanwhile, my classmate Seok-gyo walked across the room. He was happy to see Cho-eun. A smile appeared on his face. Suddenly, something abruptly attacked Seok-gyo. Before he could react, a piece of his body was eaten by the monster's head. Seok-gyo looked at his classmate, his face shocked. In front of him stood Cho-eun, whose hand was a monster's mouth. He was screaming that he was hungry. He sharply attacked Seok-gyo and asked that his friend give him his intestines and eyes. Suddenly, a black and furry hand grabbed Jo-eun's neck. It was Seok-gyo. His eyes suddenly turned bright yellow, and he asked Cho-eun if it would be fat for him to eat so much. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of bones breaking. It was Seok-gyo ripping off his friend's head. Blood poured out in a fountain and reached the ceiling. Cho-eun's head fell loudly to the ground and rolled around. Seok-gyo stood silently looking at his victim. The guy commented that he was hungry and wanted to eat. And then he turned his head to his friend's body and said that he didn't mind eating the meat. He turned and looked at Cho-eun's head. Strange eating sounds were heard from the closet where Seok-gyo was hiding. Meanwhile, someone was walking along the balcony of the gymnasium and looking at the horrors that had happened here. It was a girl with blonde hair who stopped to look at everything, and then her attention was drawn to the sounds coming from the closet. Meanwhile, the TV turned on. It was showing a program with a monkey and a bat, who introduced herself as Kim Won-sung, PhD, a teacher of evolutionary biology. He talked about new species and difficult scientific terms, pointing to pictures with his bat. Kim Won said that Dawkins said that evolution is a sequence of small changes. He went on to say that two scientists, Eldridge and Goodall, disagreed with this theory because no fossils were found. These scientists insisted that evolution did not progress smoothly, but in leaps and bounds. He gave the example that a certain type of lizard and a type of tree have not evolved so far and have retained their first record. In the end, Won-sung asked the audience which hypothesis they thought was more correct. Meanwhile, another channel had a report on the tragedy that happened 10 days ago at the Mongjang school where gas exploded, according to reporters. Then they showed memorable photos and flowers that were in the school. There were many students and relatives there, mourning their losses. Reporters said that there was a lot of criticism of the school because it did not give any explanation for what happened. And they still haven't found the physical education teacher. Suddenly, everything stopped. The man held a cut wire in his hands. Another man with brown hair came up to him and asked Detective Seok about the news, adding that he believed it was the physical education teacher's fault. Suddenly, he was hit in the leg. He was just saying that the children were very angry, and that's why the teacher killed them. The detective shouted and said that no fool would go into a building that he wanted to blow up himself. Then, a girl with short hair approached them and said that the schoolboy had woken up. The events moved to Hansen Hospital. A detective came to Seok-gyo's room. The man asked him how he was feeling and was going to tell him about what had happened. But the story did not upset or even surprise the teenager. Seok-gyo made a strong impression on Detective Seok. Then the boy asked the man if anyone else had survived. He replied that only 2 students had survived who simply did not come. The detective added that he expected Seok-gyo to open their eyes to the situation, but he noticed that the teenager's face changed dramatically and became frightened. Then he smiled sweetly and told Seok-gyo not to be afraid and to ignore the microphone, that it was just a formality. The guy said he didn't remember much. He remembered them playing basketball. The detective asked a lot of questions of Seok-gyo, but he didn't remember anything important. So Seok wrote in his notebook that the suspect didn't remember anything. The man realized that the boy would be of no help, so he left and added that he would return after the investigation. He also gave me his business card in case Seok-gyo remembered something. The detective looked at the guy with a sly look, as if he was waiting for something. The guy abruptly said that he had the same name as the investigator. Meanwhile, the men smoked and discussed the conversation with the teenager. The detective said that the gas made him forget everything. Then his partner said that Seok-gyo told his teachers a story about a monster that killed them all. Then Seok told In-ho to check the guy's background and find out who he had been in contact with recently. But the partner just exploded and attacked the detective, saying that he could not suspect the teenager of a crime. Then the detective asked about a laptop in their department that was very old and could have exploded. He added that after the question about combustibles, people usually list similar things. And Seok-gyo immediately said that there was nothing. The detective looked at his partner menacingly and said that the little shit was lying. Meanwhile, the boy had nightmares. He saw his classmate saying that he was hungry. He begged Seok-gyo for help and told her how much he was hurting. Then the teenager saw himself eating his classmate. Suddenly, Seok-gyo screamed sharply. He was breathing loudly, and cold sweat was pouring down his face. He tried to calm down and think that it was just a dream. Suddenly, Seok-gyo noticed that he was in the classroom at that moment. The teacher asked if the boy needed help and suggested that he go to the first aid post. But the guy said that everything was fine. Out of the corner of his ear, he heard his classmates discussing that Seok-gyo was crazy for coming to school after what he had been through. Suddenly the bell rang. The starosta told everyone to stand for a bow, and the teacher said that everyone could leave early. The students immediately began to gather. Suddenly someone called Han Seok-gyo by name. He looked up and saw 3 guys in front of him, offering him to leave. Screams and sounds of a fight were heard in the schoolyard. The burly guy attacked Seok-gyo and shouted that he was friends with Kyung-ho. And then Jinman picked him up by the collar and shouted that Seok-gyo shouldn't have survived. The teenager's face was all battered, but he said he didn't remember anything. At the time, Yoon Jun-sung's boyfriend was smoking and told the bully to finish with the poor man, because he was already feeling bad. But Kyung-ho yelled at his friend and said that it was Seok-gyo who killed everyone, because he didn't have a scratch on him. Then Seok-gyo looked down at his offender. Suddenly, he was hit hard in the face with a fist. Seok-gyo fell to the floor from the blow, and the other boys came over and started beating the victim. Kyung-ho shouted that they shouldn't have looked at him like that. Seok-gyo was shaking, and there was not a living spot on him. Suddenly, the teenager's teeth turned into clicks. Meanwhile, Kyung-ho called Seok-gyo names and said that he would regret being alive. Then the guy just turned around and ordered the others to leave. Seok-gyo was almost lying on the floor shaking. Meanwhile, the school was empty. Everyone had gone home. The teenager opened the door and screamed because his arm hurt. He was holding his arm and thinking that he had to go to the hospital again because his arm was completely swollen. Seok-gyo looked at her and thought about why something strange was always happening to him. He hardly cried because he had been through so much. Suddenly, Seo-hee called the guy and asked what happened to him. Seok-gyo didn't expect to see her. The girl approached her friend abruptly and reached for his face, asking where he had bruises. But the guy reacted very sharply and pulled the girl's hand away. Seo-hee was not expecting this, and neither was Seok-gyo, so he apologized. He started muttering under his breath and apologizing. Then, So-hee also started muttering about how she shouldn't have done that. They both stood there and were very embarrassed. Then Seo-hee started to say something to Seok-gyo, her face reddening. Then she looked at her friend and asked if he could walk her home. Seok-gyo hadn't expected such a development, so he was surprised, but he immediately agreed to it. He opened his locker and thought about why Seo-hee had to go with someone like him. The guy abruptly slammed the door, and the girl asked him if something was wrong with him. He looked scared. Seok-gyo lied that there was a spider, so he got scared, and then asked if Seo-hee shouldn't have taken the bag. The girl left and said she would be back soon. Seok-gyo waved politely to his friend, but was very glad to see her go. His face changed dramatically when Seo-hee left his sight. The boy slowly opened the door of his locker. Inside it was the head of a physical education teacher. Seok-gyo was trembling and did not understand anything. Meanwhile, Seo-hee picked up a wristwatch that a friend had given her. The girl put it on herself. She looked at her hand and admired the jewelry. Seo-hee walked into the classroom and told Seok-gyo that he was probably waiting for her. But the girl never received an answer. She looked around the office and realized that Seok-gyo was not there. The girl was upset and said that it looked like the boy had gone home without her, and she wanted to tell him something. Meanwhile, the subway car was racing. In it was Seok-gyo, who was holding onto his briefcase with both hands. He was trembling with fear and wondering if anyone had seen him. He thought that someone had put the teacher's head in his shoebox. The thought of going to the police flashed through his mind so that they wouldn't think that Seok-gyo was guilty. The boy recalled the words of Kyung-ho, who had beaten him, and said that he suspected him of killing the boy. At that time, he abruptly rejected the idea of going to the police, because then he would definitely be considered guilty. Suddenly, my grandmother, who was sitting downstairs, asked Seok-gyo if he was okay. The woman reached into the boy's bag and offered to hold it. Suddenly, Seok-gyo swung it and hit the woman in the face and shouted at her not to touch her. My grandmother fell to the floor and moaned in pain. The other passengers shouted in shock and looked on. They ran up to the old woman and supported her, asking if she was okay. Then, the audience abruptly turned to Seok-gyo and began calling him a criminal. It seemed to him that they were saying that they knew about the head in his briefcase and shouted that Seok-gyo had killed innocent people. Cold sweat ran down the guy's face. He was very nervous. Suddenly, Seok-gyo ran out of the subway car and shouted that it wasn't him. All the passengers were surprised by what they saw. One man started pushing the other and shouting to make way for him. He ran out of the car and shook his head, asking where Seok-gyo had gone. It turned out to be In-ho. He saw the guy running downstairs and thought that there must have been something in his bag. Meanwhile, Seok-gyo managed to run outside. He walked along it, getting lost among the people so as not to be noticed. Seok-gyo thought about himself what everyone else thought about him, that he was a weirdo or even a criminal. He decided that he should get rid of his head as soon as possible. Suddenly, someone put their hand on his neck. Seok-gyo was very frightened by this. Then, a stranger put a knife to his body and told him to keep quiet. It was a blonde girl who was on the balcony of the gym. She said that Seok-gyo had a tail behind him, so he had to not turn around. She was right, because In-ho was running after the boy. He scratched the back of his head and wondered where the boy could have gone. Suddenly, he received a call from a detective. In-ho immediately made a friendly voice, but his detective interrupted and said that his partner was running quickly to him. In-ho asked why, and was told that they had found the gym teacher on the mountain. Then from the phone I heard very loud shouts from the detective, who ordered me to run to him immediately. In-ho turned around and went to fulfill the order. A girl with blonde hair was watching. She put a knife to Seok-gyo's face and ordered him to be quiet, otherwise she would stab him in the gut. And then she added that the guy should follow her quietly. The girl led him through some strange alleys. She was so close to him that her large, lush breasts rubbed against the boy's body. When walking, it was felt especially strongly. Seok-gyo could sense this and asked her not to press against him so hard. Then she said that the guy was a pervert and only wanted breasts. Seok-gyo shouted at the girl and asked where she was taking him and if she had put his head in the box. Then I heard the sound of the wind from the knife. The girl pointed to the door of his basement and told him to go there. But Seok-gyo shouted that she had to answer his question first. But the girl did not listen to the guy's cries and simply kicked him. Then Seok-gyo flew straight down the stairs. He landed downstairs, hitting the wall. After that, the girl came up and took him by the shirt and dragged him along. And then she threw the poor thing into a room like a kitten. Seok-gyo held his head and was outraged that he had been treated so rudely. Suddenly, the door of the room slammed loudly. The guy saw this and started yelling at her to open the door. But then I calmed down because I realized that it made no sense. Meanwhile, there was a sink with a tap in the room. In general, the interior of the room was covered in blood and rust. It was as if someone had been tortured there before. Seok-gyo heard a sound and flinched. He turned toward the sound and could not believe his eyes. The guy took the hand of a corpse in his hands. Seok-gyo screamed and threw her into the wall away from him. His eyes were full of fear. Suddenly, he decided to look up. There was a monster on the ceiling, similar to the ones his classmates had turned into. Then the monster jumped to the floor. He took the boy's briefcase, and it began to scurry around, as if the monster could smell the teacher's head. The monster itself looked like a spider because it had many legs or arms. Seok-gyo immediately exploded and ran to the door. He was screaming and beating on the door for someone to help him and let him out. Suddenly, a sharp part of the monster stuck into the door. It was some kind of claw with something wet dripping from it. The monster took him out of the door and pulled him toward it. The monster girl shouted that she was very hungry and slowly approached Seok-gyo. Then the guy opened a drawer with some kitchen utensils in it. Seok-gyo picked up a knife and threatened the monster to keep her away from him. Suddenly, the same claw knocked the weapon out of the guy's hands. Then, its tentacles wrapped around both of Seok-gyo's arms. It had nowhere to go. The boy was lifted high up, screaming for the monster to let him out. Suddenly, Seok-gyo's body was pierced by the monster's tentacle claw. Foam flowed from the guy's mouth. After that, his eyes began to close and he lost consciousness. Then, Seok-gyo just fell to the ground, exhausted. The guy realized that he could not move, as if he was paralyzed. He was looking at a huge monster with another mouth at the bottom of its body. He was telling Seok-gyo to stay with him and not to run away. The guy realized that he had to get himself together and act. He saw the head of a physical education teacher in front of him. Seok-gyo realized that he could have ended up like him, so he had to come up with something. Meanwhile, tentacles were coming out of the monster's lower mouth, and Seok-gyo was about to be eaten. Suddenly, the guy's eyes turned yellow again. The furry paw grabbed the monster with its claws. Seok-gyo held onto the monster's head. His eyes were animalistic and his teeth were sharp as fangs. He was out for blood. The monster tried to get out of Seok-gyo's paw, but he failed. Common sense was still getting through to the guy's head. He looked at his hand and did not understand what was happening. Suddenly, his hairy hand simply crushed the monster's head to the floor at speed. The monster was screaming and begging to stop. Meanwhile, the sound of breaking bones could be heard. Blood was splattered all over the room. The monster was very big, so it left a lot of traces behind. Meanwhile, the old monitor showed the moment of the monster's death. A guy was sitting at the table, and next to him was the same blonde girl. They were looking at the monitor together. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. After that, he said that he hadn't seen anything like it for a long time, and added that it looked like uncontrollable. The girl commented that Seok-gyo had no control over himself and transformed whenever he wanted, so she suggested killing him right away, to which the boy replied that Seok-gyo was very strong because he had dealt with an uncontrollable person who had previously killed 2 of his kind. He decided that when the young man returned to his normal form, they would decide. The girl was not pleased, but kept silent. Then the guy said it was time to go and asked her to come with him. Meanwhile, Seok-gyo looked at his hands, which were covered in blood, and the other was even shaggy. He could not believe what he was seeing and thought he was hallucinating. Then the guy looked away. He saw broken glass and blood on the floor. Suddenly, the guy watching through the monitor told Seok-gyo that if he wanted to cut off his arm, it would be very painful and offered a bet. After these words, Seok-gyo attacked the stranger with threats and broken glass. Then, the guy turned to a girl named Jong-hye and asked her if she had brought Seok-gyo here by threatening her with a knife. He said that he had asked her not to do that. After that, some bars fell to the floor. The guy commented that it was a special invention. High-calorie chocolate bars. Seok-gyo still didn't trust these people. Then the guy explained that chocolate is very tasty, although it does not satisfy hunger, but it is just right for a snack. But he didn't finish, because Seok-gyo interrupted him and ordered him to shut up. He became angry and attacked the kidnappers, asking them what they had done to his arm. The guy approached him, but Seok-gyo threatened him with a knife again and ordered him not to come closer. Suddenly, the kidnapper simply opened one of the chocolate bars. Then, with a smile, he handed it to Seok-gyo. He added that they did not do anything to his arm, because the teenager had changed himself. Seok-gyo listened to this and looked at his food. He was shaking. Suddenly, a candy bar was snatched from his hands by lightning. The teenager began to eat it very quickly. He was really hungry. When I finished, I looked at the pile of other bars. He pounced on them and began to consume them right in the wrapper. The kidnapper looked at this and smiled. After that, he began to explain that they were people who had been reborn into a new super species. The guy started telling a story. It was a group on the beach where they were photographed near a cave. The 3 girls were laughing loudly and talking to each other. They were drinking water, and one of them commented that it was incredible and had bubbles. She advised Mother Yeon to drink it. It turned out that this particular woman had her first symptoms 10 years ago. After a while, she grabbed her stomach, which was making sounds of poisoning. Some guy noticed this and asked if my mother was poisoned. But in fact, the woman's stomach was hurting because of the mineral water she had drunk from the cave. A few hours later, in the barn, the woman felt sick again. Yo-Yo was vomiting blood. It didn't look like poisoning. Her mouth and hands were covered in blood. The woman started crying because she thought she was sick with something and thought she was dying. Then she decided to go inside the barn so that others wouldn't see her. Suddenly, she saw something. There were many piglets in front of her, grunting loudly. And on Sunday, Yo-Yeon was no longer human. Terrible sounds and screams were coming from the barn. There was a woman inside, covered in blood. The room was also covered in blood, and there were many dead pigs lying around. Yo-Young's face looked terrible, like she was a lunatic who had escaped from a mental institution. But her transformation did not end there. She started writing and reading in English, even though she had never been taught the language. She also worked effortlessly at a computer she had never seen in her life. But the most surprising thing was that she learned to drive a tractor. On one of her tractor rides, a young man in a car started mocking her and calling her a hillbilly. But Yo-Yo didn't pay any attention to it. The boy continued to mock her. The last straw was the phrase about the woman amusing the young men with her accent. After that, there was such a loud sound that the crows fled from the forest. The rich guy's car crashed. Yo-Yeon could change her body at will, both in size and density. But after returning to the human register, something terrible happened. The woman was experiencing a brutal and uncontrollable hunger. She realized that she had to learn more about herself and to find people like her. She started a club. That's how their organization was founded. The kidnapper finished his story. After that, Seok-gyo asked if he was supposed to believe this nonsense, and he advised them to read less manga. Then Jong-ye asked if Seok-gyo wanted proof and pulled out a knife. The guy asked how it was possible that a person could start transforming into another species just like that. Then the other kidnapper replied that they were all infected with something similar to a virus. He explained that the virus entered the body through water, namely through sewage and mineral water, and completely changes the human gene. But it was also known that not all people who drank water from the same source were infected. The organization was still trying to figure out why this was happening. He also added that there were people who were affected differently by the virus and just kept mutating continuously. They called them uncontrollable or defective. He added that the creatures that Seok-gyo killed in the hall were just that. Suddenly, the teenager screamed that he hadn't killed anyone and that he didn't remember anything. In response, the kidnapper told him that Seok-gyo didn't remember anything because he had good judgment. He added that the teenager also looked partially defective. After all, severe hunger was the only thing they felt after losing their minds, and the lack of food needed for the mutation led to death. He added that ordinary people catch the changes in all their glory, so to protect the species, witnesses must be removed, and that's why Jong Haye wanted to kill Seok-gyo before he was reborn. Then he said that he decided to give the teenager a chance because they were short of manpower. He then asked if Seok-gyo would join their organization. Meanwhile, the teenager was already at home. He was met by an angry mother and a father who tried to calm her down. Suddenly, the woman started crying and shouting about why her son was not picking up the phone. She was very worried about him. And then she switched to the side of Seok-gyo and asked what happened to him and if anyone had beaten him up. The guy denied everything, but the marks on his body said otherwise. The mother reached for Seok-gyo's hand and began to say that she was going to school. Suddenly, the boy waved his hand away, hitting his mother. Her father caught her and started yelling at his son to apologize to her. But Seok-gyo was just muttering to himself. After that, he just ran into his room and slammed the door loudly, shouting that it was their own fault for getting in. His parents would not let it go. So they knocked on the door and demanded that he come out immediately and talk about his behavior. Meanwhile, the boy was shaking violently. He thought about the offer to join the monster organization. These thoughts made him very nervous. Seok-gyo recalled the words of the kidnapper, who said that the teenager's life among normal people was ordered to him. After all, the boy would be constantly hungry. He added that if Seok-gyo did any harm, they would get rid of him. Meanwhile, the parents were still breaking into the teenager's room. Suddenly, Seok-gyo began to transform. His arm grew fur and his eyes turned yellow. He was shaking and thinking that he had become a monster. Seok-gyo was sitting on the bed, covered with a blanket. Suddenly, he received a notification on his phone. He looked at it and decided to revise it. It turned out that So-hee wrote to him and asked how he was feeling. After that, she asked Seok-gyo to meet her. The guy thought it was very strange that So-hee suddenly started imposing her communication on him. A new day has come. So-hee and Seok-gyo met up after all. She asked him if he was okay, because he had been away from school for a week and she was worried. Seok-gyo said that he was feeling better and asked why So-hee had called him. He replied that she wanted to cheer him on at the movies because of the fight. Seok-gyo was very excited to hear about the movie and asked what movie they were going to see. It turned out that they went to see a movie about Doraemon, the character on So-hee's watch. It seemed that Seok-gyo was not very happy when he saw this, but the girl looked happy and said she was very glad she had managed to buy tickets because it was the last day of the show. Seok-gyo then asked if So-hee really had a huge crush on Doraemon, but the girl didn't hear him, and the guy decided not to repeat it. There were a lot of people. Everyone wanted to see the movie. The teenagers were waiting for the movie, and So-hee started talking about how it was the first time they had ever been to the movies together. After that, there was a shy silence. Seok-gyo suddenly jumped up and said he was going to get food, and So-hee said she wanted to go with him. But the guy refused and ran away very abruptly, saying that he would do everything himself because So-hee had bought the tickets. The girl again did not understand anything. Meanwhile, the guy had already bought everything. Seok-gyo was very worried because he didn't understand what he was doing here with a girl like So-hee. He realized that she was definitely not connected to the organization. When Seok-gyo was walking back, he noticed that a large group of guys had gathered around So-hee. They would hit on her and offer her all kinds of indecent things. The girl was scared and asked the boys to leave her alone, but one of the guys grabbed So-hee's shoulder as she was trying to run away from them and started saying something, but he was interrupted, after which a loud sound occurred. Seok-gyo grabbed the ignorant man's arm, shielding Seo-hee. The guy was furious and demanded an explanation from the boys, squeezing the offender's hand harder. Suddenly, the boy's head became the head of an antelope. The horned animal shouted at him with a threat. Seok-gyo couldn't believe his eyes. The boy began threatening to gouge out the teenager's eyes for staring. But now there were 3 animal heads in front of Seok-gyo. He didn't even listen to the boy's ridicule. The teenager was still in a stupor and could not believe what he was seeing. He pinched the antelope's cheek and said that he had changed a lot. Then, the ignorant man decided to attack Seok-gyo, but the teenager grabbed his arm again. Then, he grabbed the antelope's neck. He lifted him up high, as if he were picking up feathers. Seok-gyo was surprised at how light the boy was. Meanwhile, behind him stood So-hee with the face of a rabbit. She was very nervous as she watched what was happening. The thought flashed through Seok-gyo's mind that it was all just a dream, so there were only animals around. He was still holding the antelope by the throat, even though it said it had no room to breathe. But Seok-gyo didn't stop. His eyes suddenly turned yellow and his heart beat faster, adrenaline pumping through his blood. Suddenly, the teenager realized what was happening. Then he abruptly let go of the guy, and he fell to the ground. Now everyone looked normal. His gang ran up to him to support him. Other visitors watched, and they were now very afraid of Seok-gyo. Seo-hee didn't know what to say, so she just said the boy's name. Seok-gyo started muttering nervously to himself. After that, he abruptly ran away with So-hee shouting after him. The events moved to a park by the river. Seok-gyo was sitting on a bench, and next to him was a large pile of food, or rather what was left of it. The teenager was very nervous because he felt like a real monster because he almost killed that guy without any doubt. He suddenly remembered the expression on his captor's face, and his words about harming others. Seok-gyo realized then that he could not stay here any longer. He was shaking and sweating. Meanwhile, a dog was tied up and floating on the water, crying loudly. In front of her stood 3 guys who had most likely committed the crime and were loudly mocking the animal. Seok-gyo saw this and heard one of the boys say that if the dog fell into the water, no one would care. After that, the children started taking pictures of it and saying they would post it on social media. Suddenly, a hand grabbed one of the guy's shoulders. It was Seok-gyo. He scolded the children for what they had done, but the boy told the teenager to fuck off because he was interfering with his movie. This phrase infuriated Seok-gyo, and he started shouting and scolding the children for their terrible behavior. Meanwhile, Seo-hee ran to the park looking for a friend. She looked around, wondering where else Seok-gyo could have run to. Suddenly, she heard a quarrel and a familiar voice. She saw Seok-gyo and the children, who were not going to listen to the teenager. The boy saw the dog swimming away and whimpering loudly. Then he decided to follow him and put his foot in the water. Seok-gyo was very angry, but he still went after the dog. When he reached the animal, the water was up to his neck. Fascinated, so he watched. Meanwhile, the children were about to leave as if nothing had happened. Seok-gyo came out of the water holding the dog and talking about how cruel children can be and how he was now all wet because of them. Suddenly, someone handed him a towel. He looked up and saw Seo-hee standing there. His reaction showed that he was very surprised. The girl began to tell a story about how Seok-gyo once took a cat down from a tall tree in the schoolyard when he was in elementary school. No one wanted to help the cat back then. Seo-hee added that she has liked Seok-gyo ever since and for a very long time. The guy was even more shocked by what he heard and did not know what to say. So he then decided to repeat herself and said that she liked the guy very much. She blushed all over. Then Seok-gyo blushed and started muttering under his breath. In his mind, he knew he shouldn't have confessed back because he was a monster. But that smile of Seo-hee's was driving him crazy, so he told her how he felt. And then his mind went blank. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in some dark basement where construction was underway. Some woman was running from fear she was being chased. She kept turning back and lost one shoe on the way. The woman tripped over a stone because of the heel on the other pair, and then she fell loudly to the ground. The woman was shaking with fear. She suddenly screamed, holding her head with her hands. We could hear the scream even outside, it was so loud. The woman was shaking, and cold sweat was pouring down her face. She said in a trembling voice that she needed to find her phone and started looking for it in her bag. When I took it out, I dropped it on the ground from nerves. She was trembling and trying to calm herself down. She turned on her mobile device, and it started slowly. Finally, the phone screen lit up, but through the light of her cell phone, the woman saw the head of a monster in front of her, who wanted her dead. In the morning, a large crowd of police officers, rescuers, and ordinary passers-by gathered near the scene. The entire room was covered in blood. The workers were looking for the victim's hand, whose corpse was being taken out by pathologists. Another corpse was photographed by another medical worker. Nearby was the body of the same woman who had fled at night. She was also photographed. Detective Seok-gyo crouched down by the body and looked at it in silence. Meanwhile, his partner was vomiting around the corner. Then the man asked how such a weakling could become a criminalist. The man said that it was the woman who had disappeared on Sunday. Another worker asked if it was done for the sake of organs, but there was no connection. He was indignant at the denial of his hypothesis because he was sure of it. At the time, Detective Seok-gyo said it was too messy for the black market, and then added that the marks showed that she had been bitten with her teeth, not cut. He added that this was the third case in a year, and it was necessary to inform the media about it. Another man with a cigarette was indignant and asked why the detective was getting out. He made a pull and said that they would not publicize anything for now and would just pretend that the bodies were scattered separately. The man added that because of public dissatisfaction, their superiors would reprimand them. And then he said that the detective had been harassed because he talked too much in Seoul, so he advised Seok-gyo to keep quiet. After that, the man started shouting at the other boy to forget what home was until they found the culprit. And when the employee left, the man said that they were all fools because it was impossible to find him. Meanwhile, the detective stepped back and noticed something. He thought that the first body was found in the neighborhood, and now the murders were getting closer. The criminal gained courage. The events moved to Seok-gyo's apartment. His mother was in the kitchen chopping green onions. She was completely absorbed in her thoughts. And then I started crying because the onions made my eyes water. She didn't even notice her son approaching her. He scratched the back of his head and said hello to his mother. But the mother was very happy to see her son, and tears welled up in her eyes. She pounced on her son with questions about his sleep and whether he would eat. A few minutes later, the whole family was eating breakfast together. His mother pulled out the egg roll that Seok-gyo loved so much. The boy felt embarrassed after that. His mother noticed and commented that her son was surprisingly serious. Meanwhile, a dog came to them with a stitch mark on his hip. The mother greeted him and said that the dog was hungry too, and Seok-gyo seemed surprised to see the animal. The dog just started eating its food as if nothing had happened. The mother commented that she was very surprised when Seok-gyo brought the dog home, but she recalled how, as a child, the boy always brought home animals he rescued and felt very sorry for them. Seok-gyo justified himself by not bringing the dog back for good. When he found the owner, he promised to return the dog immediately. The mother laughed merrily, her voice so warm and gentle. She said their son hadn't changed at all, especially when it came to animals. Seok-gyo did not expect to hear this from his mother's. He felt embarrassed because he thought he was a monster. His mother's words had a positive effect on him, and he decided that he had not changed and was just sick. Seok-gyo promised himself that he would get better and become normal. His life would go back to the way it was before. Meanwhile, the school bell rang. Seok-gyo walked down the school corridor and looked at his phone. The guy corresponded with So-hee. He offered to walk her home after school, and she agreed. Seok-gyo smiled like a fool. He was so happy at that moment. After that, he opened the door to enter the classroom. All the students were staring at the boy. The classroom immediately became loud as everyone whispered and discussed Seok-gyo's return. One of the boys standing by the teenager's desk asked if he was really in the hospital with post-traumatic stress. The boys said they were happy for Seok-gyo, that he was getting better, and expressed their support for everything he had been through. Those were the bullies who had beaten him up. But Seok-gyo just smiled sweetly and said that they shouldn't apologize because everything was fine. Then, the teenager decided to ask if anything happened in his absence, and hinted at the physical education teacher. Suddenly, my classmates began to talk excitedly about the new girl, how beautiful she was and how lucky they were. One of the boys said that she was better than even the idols. Just then, the girl walked into the classroom. The classroom door opened and a white head was visible. Then her face appeared. She looked at Seok-gyo. It turned out to be the same girl who had kidnapped the teenager. The guy was furious. He couldn't believe that Jong-hee had transferred to their class. The events moved to the school roof. Seok-gyo was dragging Jong-hee along, furious. After that, he chained the girl to the wall so that she could not move her arms. Seok-gyo started yelling at the girl for coming here and not even giving him time to think. Suddenly, Zhang Hie's face changed and she asked why the boy thought she was here for him. Then Seok-gyo shouted and asked why the girl was here. Zhang Hie's face turned sly, and she replied that she wanted to study with him in the same class and that there was a defective person in the school. After that, Seok-gyo's face also changed and became scared, and he asked if there was really another monster in the school. Meanwhile, the events moved to the noisy street. There was a building there called the Association for Environmental Research. The teenagers came there and stood in front of the office. Zhang Hie asked Seok-gyo if he had thought it through and added that they would only let him go if he was dead. The guy was silent for a while. It was clear that he was worried. Then, Seok-gyo replied that there was nothing to worry about and that he was ready, and then opened the door to his office. Inside, there was a large room with enough people just going about their business. Seok-gyo looked around. Some were talking to doctors, others were just working. Others filled out documents and registered. Zhang Hie noticed Seok-gyo's strange state and asked him why he stopped and ordered him to go check in. At the reception desk, they asked him if it was his first time here and told him what information to enter. After that, Seok-gyo had to go to the support center. The room looked like a school. There were desks, a large blackboard, and someone was telling something. The man stood up and introduced himself as Kim Philip and said he was their coordinator. He came up to the projector and started telling them that they were cannibals and joked that he would be imprisoned. It turned out that Kim Philip was talking about how to lead a normal life and not give himself away. The first rule was that hunting people was forbidden. In exchange, they would provide them with an endless supply of food to cover their needs, which would reduce the likelihood of being caught while hunting. The second rule was that transformation was allowed only in certain areas, and that mishaps had to be reported through a special program. And then Kim Philip turned around and added that if people noticed them in the process, they should be disposed of immediately. He added that it happened that superhumans accidentally killed or deliberately left someone alive. In such cases, the organization would remove both the monster and the witness. Kim Philip smiled and added that he hoped none of them would be led by emotions. The third rule was that cooperation with the media and news was prohibited, but if interaction was inevitable, the organization would take care of it. He also added that if they were photographed or filmed, they should immediately tell them about it. Seok-gyo whispered to Zhang Hie about how serious it was and that he had already broken all the rules. The girl called the guy a jerk and said that now he knew everything, because the organization had done a lot to hush up his case. And then she added that if Hyun hadn't vouched for him, Seok-gyo would have been dead long ago. After that, she commented that she didn't understand why Gu Hyun liked him so much, and then said that she hoped Seok-gyo would die soon. Meanwhile, Kim Philip continued to lecture and said that the organization was doing everything possible for their safety, and added that they were one team. He said goodbye and told me to take the brochure. The class became animated. Everyone was discussing something, getting to know each other. Seok-gyo came over to take the brochure. Suddenly, another teenager approached the boy and put his arm around him, asking if he was the one who had praised Hyun so much. He praised Seok-gyo for taking down the uncontrollable in the basement in one fell swoop. The teenager was not used to receiving such compliments. Then, the guy introduced himself as Park Jong-tae. He was the leader of the 7th group of new recruits. He asked Seok-gyo if he had chosen a group, and if he would go on patrol with him. The teenager knew nothing about it, so he was very surprised that he had to patrol something. Jong-tae explained that as soon as newcomers joined the organization, they were to immediately assemble a team and go on patrol, killing the unruly. The guy went on to say that there were supposed to be 2 more people in their group, but they died last week, so Seok-gyo was going to join them. The teenager began to panic and did not know what to say. Jong-tae noticed this and said that Zhang Hie's group was all shell-shocked, and if he went to them, he would be dead immediately. Zhang Hie then rudely told Jong-tae to shut up because she was on the phone. After that, the guy whispered to Seok-gyo that the girl was just a devil. Then, one of Jong-tae's friends said that he had to leave early because he had a funeral for his father. The guy was upset and said he wanted to see the new guys in the business. Meanwhile, the events moved to the store. Jong-tae ordered Seok-gyo to go upstairs, and they were to search the lower floors. In fact, the teenager was very afraid and trembling, lighting his way with the flashlight of his phone. He walked and was afraid of literally every creak. Suddenly, Seok-gyo heard strange sounds and screamed. The teenager shone a flashlight and saw that it was just mice. After that, he asked out loud where his life was going. Meanwhile, Seok-gyo had already gone to the restroom. He looked at the entrance and was nervous, as if he felt some kind of danger. But I decided to go there because I wanted to use the restroom myself. Seok-gyo didn't see that there were bloody handprints near the sign. He just calmly walked to the entrance and was glad to have finally found it. Suddenly, someone knocked him down. That someone was as scared as Seok-gyo was of being found. The stranger was dressed in black and was running away from the boy. But Seok-gyo didn't pay any attention to this, only indignantly saying that if he was in a hurry, he shouldn't have led everyone astray. The guy went to the restroom and began to relieve himself. Suddenly, Seok-gyo realized that it was an abandoned building. Then he thought about where the person was from and sweat ran down his face. Suddenly, he felt something behind him, and his heart beat faster. Seok-gyo turned and shone the flashlight, shouting loudly. On the other side was the corpse of a guy who had been hanged. Seok-gyo shouted loudly and began to call everyone over. Then, Jong-tae entered the restroom, pushing the door open hard. The teenager pointed to his body, but the team wasn't scared. On the contrary, Jong-tae was pleased that Seok-gyo had done a good job and began to praise him. Suddenly, he was interrupted by the sound of vomiting. It was Seok-gyo, standing by the toilet, barely able to contain himself. The guy who went to the funeral took a blood smear and said that the handwriting was like that of a field mouse. And then, he came back to the team and said that the guy was still warm. If they had come earlier, they could have captured the uncontrollable. Then Jong-tae asked Seok-gyo if he had seen anything. The teenager replied that a guy had run into him, but it was dark and he didn't notice anything. He suddenly remembered the expression on the stranger's face, or rather his eyes. Then, it was as if an understanding came to Seok-gyo. Jong-tae, meanwhile, said that Seok-gyo seemed more capable and was simultaneously crunching his fist. Suddenly, the teenager said that he seemed to know the uncontrollable. The team turned to him in shock. Seok-gyo said it was a student from his school.